Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of APLIC and our keynote session with Dave Snowden. My name is Monica Shineko. I'm the Director of Libraries Australia at the National Library of Australia. This conference is brought to you by 3 library associations from Australia, New Zealand and Singapore. And I encourage you to stop by their stands in the exhibition hall to talk about your membership of your library association. For me, being a member of ALIA has been one of the most enriching professional experiences of my life. I think of it a bit like taking a slow-release vitamin tablet that draws you through your career. So if you're not a member, consider why you might not be a member. I dare you to leap over to the stands at the exhibition room next door and roar with your association. Thank you to our partners and sponsors for their support of this conference, and a special thank you to Oxford University Press for their support as the conference Gold Partner. The Twitter hashtag is #APLIC18. Please join the conversation. Now, Dave Snowden divides his time between 2 roles: the founder Chief Scientific Officer of Cognitive Edge, and the founder and director of the Centre of Applied Complexity at Bangor University in Wales. His work is international in nature and covers government and industry, looking at complex issues relating to strategy, organisational decision-making and decision-making. He has pioneered a science-based approach to organisations drawing on anthropology, neuroscience and complex adaptive systems theory. He is a popular and passionate keynote speaker on a range of subjects and is well known for his pragmatic cynicism and iconoclastic style. His company, Cognitive Edge, exists to integrate academic thinking with practice in organisations throughout the world and operates on a network model, working with academics, government, commercial organisations, NGOs and independent consultants. He is also the main designer of the SenseMaker software, originally developed in the field of counter-terrorism and now being actively deployed in both government and industry to handle issues of impact measurement, customer-employee insight, narrative-based knowledge management, strategic foresight and risk management. Dave tells me he's very happy for this to be a freewheeling session with space for your questions, and the only stipulation that I would make is that we need to be finished by morning tea time. So please welcome Dave Snowden to the stage.
Thank you. The other introduction I'm quite fond of is professional curmudgeon, all right? And I'm prepared to work with that one. I'm happy to take interruptions. I have no problem with hecklers. Yeah, it makes life more entertaining. And I'll try and leave some room for questions at the end. If not, I'll be around all day. But I'm going on to Tasmania tomorrow, but I'll talk a bit about that later. I'm hoping some people are old enough to remember this phrase from the 70s of practice makes perfect. What I want to talk about is the interaction of theory and practice. I'm going to argue against practice on its own or theory on its own. And I really want to get to the point where I want to reintroduce some of the concepts of the oral tradition and the way in which the oral tradition is key to identity. So what I'm going to do is introduce some of the core science and then talk about some of the methods and particularly talk about the work we're now doing on citizen engagement and how we use young people to be the voice of their communities and through which the voice of old and middle-aged people can sing. And I'm going to talk about that. We just completed the pilot projects in Wales and in Colombia, and that's one of the areas where we think is part of the future of libraries, to be honest, is to be the agency for that sort of interaction within society. So there'll be an appeal in this as we go through. Now, I was moved, as many I think of you were, by Opeta's conversation yesterday about the role of identity, right? And that struck a home with me. I don't speak Welsh. I am Welsh. I'm not English. Now you know that. To call me English is a deadly insult, and the children of my children will seek out your children until the 7th generation. The Italians have no idea of vendetta. We're much better at it as Celts, all right? But my grandmother was the last in our generation to speak Welsh, and at the turn of the last century, the English decided we should be educated. That was quite generous of them, really, but it had to be in English. If you don't know it, Welsh troops had English officers right through to the Second World War. They were treated as colonial troops. So if my grandmother was caught speaking Welsh in primary school, she had a wooden badge hung around her neck called the Welsh Knot, as in N-O-T. If she then had to catch one of her friends speaking Welsh, and whoever wore the knot at the end of the day got thrashed by the teacher. To the day of her death, if somebody came to the house, she spoke in this appalling English accent, but she'd be made to feel ashamed of her own tradition, her own background. And that's a story which has been repeated on indigenous and non-indigenous populations around the world, really for the history of humanity. And this quote from Alistair MacIntyre, I think, really summarizes this. Like me, he studied under McCabe at Blackfriars. If you deprive children of their stories, you make them anxious stutterers in their own existence. Yeah, and what I'm going to build onto this is the role of narrative in providing identity, but also for meaning as an agency of change. So that's where I'm going to come to. And if there was ever a need for us to understand identity, it's in the modern world. The general approach, by the way, is called anthro-complexity. It's the combination of anthropology and complexity science. And I should say my first degree is physics and philosophy as a joint major. And when I did it, it was a private indulgence, mainly because my father was a veterinary surgeon, and if you're taken out at the age of 14 to do sheath washings on bulls on freezing cold January mornings, surrounded by Welsh farmers who are there to actually humiliate you, you decide to do theoretical physics and philosophy as a way of avoiding any such future encounter. Right? But either way, one of the problems with this is it taught me to have a contempt for social science from two completely different disciplines. And I haven't shaken it off since, and you'll see that come through as we come. But what I'm going to do is introduce some of the science as we go. It's the truism at the moment that we live in an age where certainty is inherent. You can't reduce it. One of the scary things is people talk about a post-fact society. If you actually know your history, you know we've never been a fact-based society. It's basically who people believe in. And for a long period, people were prepared to believe in experts, but they weren't, and that's gone away. You know, that hasn't worked, so they're now trying populists for a change. Right? It's deeply disturbing because an evidence-based approach, lying has now become a profession rather than something you try and pretend you don't do. It's something you're actually quite proud of, yeah, in many circles. Right? And we've lost a sort of contract, I think. I mean, when I was very young, well, I was at the age of 11, it was 1964, and in primary schools in those days, you actually had to debate. In fact, from the age of 11 to 18, we debated every week in my school. So every week on a designated day, you stood up, you were given a card. I still remember the first one I had at 11, and it said, "You support capital punishment." And I had to speak for 7 minutes on something I profoundly disagree with without notice, and we did that every week from the age of 11 to 18. That made us super critical, and it meant we read everything, because you didn't know what you were going to get hit with. Yeah? And that actually is one of the key things I'm going to come back to, is the need to make people critical, is to give them a mechanism by which to become critical rather than try and teach it. Yeah? We learned to do evidence. If you have to argue things you don't believe in, then actually it makes you far more critical than anything else, and it's a process we seem to have lost. But either way, in primary school, before I went up to the grammar school, we had an election, and all schools then had a mock election. And I won it for the Labour Party. Sorry, I come from a South Wales family. That means this is part of your blood, all right? You can't avoid it, all right? And it was a good job I won it, because my mother was a Labour Party candidate for the constituency. If I hadn't won it, there would have been family repercussions, all right? And there was a wise old woman called Mrs. EMC Davis. I still remember, and I would never call her anything else but Mrs. EMC Davis. Yeah? She was a magistrate, and she sat for one of the big council estates. And she sent most of the people who voted for her to prison on a regular basis. But they weren't fussed about it, because she looked after their family. They knew they'd done wrong, and she was their magistrate, and she was fair, so they would all turn out and vote for her. She was one of those sort of matriarchal figures. And they say if you grow up in South Wales, you grow up in a matriarchy, you're mildly afraid of your wife, you're scared of your daughter. Your grandmother is a terrifying figure, and if your great-grandmother is angry with you, leave the country, all right? You don't stand any chance. So either way, she decided I obviously wanted to be a politician, so I got taken out for tea. Now, you need to understand, this is a terrible prospect, all right? Mrs. EMC Davis is taking you out for tea, right? And I had this lecture, which has stayed with me to this day. She said, you obviously want to be a politician. I didn't actually, but she decided I was being influenced, I think. And she said, you need to understand, I look after my people so they accept my ideology. The day you believe they accept your ideology is the day you've lost. Yeah? Now, I hold that because I think that's something we've kind of like forgot, yeah, in terms of the overall context of civil society. Yeah, the price of having the opportunity to have certain types of conversations is you look after people's day-to-day lives and you show respect and empathy for them. And to some extent, we've lost. And so I'm going to build back to that in a minute. The second thing here is the concept of a trope. I don't buy the concept of a meme. That's really bad science, all right? Like the whole Dawkins stuff, all right? The idea genes seek to replicate themselves is something I can't find a single geneticist who takes seriously, but never mind, right? Trope is a dominant narrative form that you can't escape. Yeah, now, actually, they're quite scary, and this links in, if anybody wants the real academic stuff on this, this is Deleuzian assemblage theory. As we tell stories, we like to hear other stories like the stories we've told. It's quite interesting. Within 3 months of people joining an organization, their own personal stories are modified to match the dominant narrative form of the organization they're a part of. It's one of the ways in which corporate cultures survive, even though high turnover. So we like to fit in. Yeah? And the trouble is, if everybody is telling the same type of story and you can't escape from that story, it actually has, it's called an assemblage, it has an existence independent of the storytellers, and people can't escape that pattern. If anybody, I spend a lot of my time in the US, yeah, and I can tell this over a beer later if anybody wants, but the day after the election from Trump, we were actually dumped into a Midwest bar told to argue against Trump. And the concluding part of this thing is somebody looked at me, I was using a Socratic technique to try and argue the point, and he said, that's his fucking education speaking, and walked away. Right? And that's actually quite scary if you think about it, because you've now got a trope which actually will not permit any sort of logical argument. Right? And there are tropes in all sorts of societies. One of the things we're doing is to measure them. We then have the village idiot syndrome. I have to give credit to a friend of mine in the Mounties. He said it used to be that every village had an idiot and it didn't matter because people knew who the idiots were. But now the idiots have banded together on the internet to legitimize idiocy. Yeah, and I think that's one of the most profound sayings I've ever heard, right? Is that actually that is a problem and we need to deal with it. Yeah? Identity is a massive issue. Yeah, we can't be homogenized. One of the great mistakes, I think, of people, liberal people, has been to try and homogenize people into some international, sort of fluffy bunny, kumbaya type group. One of the things we know from anthropology is if you don't have differences, people will create them. Yeah? I'm married to somebody who's English, but God help us come the rugby internationals, all right? I mean, I go down to Cardiff because we can't be in the same house, all right? Society needs differences. We need tribal differences, right? We need ways in which we can establish separate identity. We need heterogeneity, not homogeneity. Right? Now, the issue in our modern identity politics is how do we create differences which are actually positive rather than differences which are negative? And how do we create meaning in lives? Yeah, we face a world in which the chances of people being able, well, the immigration problem in Northern Europe at the moment is like a small microcosm of what it's going to be in 20 or 30 years' time, when most of the Middle East becomes inhabitable due to high temperatures. All right? So the issue of how do we find meaning in a society under increasing levels of resource constraint is something that not enough people are thinking about, and we haven't got the sort of raw data to work with. I'm doing the pessimistic side up front. Right? We then have the problem with butterfly effects. Politicians jump on something which worked. Now, it's a famous, it's called the butterfly effect. It's a famous cliche. The idea is a butterfly flaps its wings in the Amazonian rainforest, as a result of which there's a hurricane in Texas. Now, if this was actually a causal relationship, the butterflies wouldn't have survived, all right? I know Texans. Yeah, by now, they'd have been subject to vigilante action with extreme prejudice involving large guns, all right? The point is that something very small on this occasion combines with other small things and uniquely creates a hurricane. It doesn't mean every time a butterfly flaps its wings, it will create a hurricane. Yeah? There's another effect called Hawthorne effect. Yeah? Famous studies up in New York State in the 1920s, they increased lighting levels in factories, people became more productive. These days, they would now publish a book called Light, The Secret to Productivity, and go on the conference circuit, all right? In those days, they had some pretenses to be real scientists, so they lowered the lighting level, and people became more productive. And what they actually found is if you do something novel and pay attention to people, it always works the first 1 or 2 times, but it won't scale. And then there's cobra effect. This is from the English in India. They decided there were too many hooded cobras. And having had a couple of encounters, I agree, right? So they announced a 1 rupee reward for every cobra head brought into the district commission. And that worked really well for 6 months until people realized the commercial opportunities to be had in breeding cobras. The English found out about that, so got disturbed, so they cancelled the reward, at which point there was no value in the cobras, so they were released into the wild, and the net effect was the cobra population went up. The UN announces new development goals. A government announces a new major initiative. Everybody uses find and replace on the word processor to match the new language of power in order to get funding. Yeah? We're just not thinking of a proper evidence-based approach for what will work or not work in terms of the way things happen. Yeah? And that's why you can't use an empirical approach if we're going to deal with things. And the final thing here is these days we have a world of specialists. And during conditions of stress, that's when you need the generalists. And there's hardly any generalists left. I think in the UK educational system, there ain't any left now under the age of 55, because we actually focus people on learning in very narrow bands from a very young age. So the ability to synthesize different disciplines isn't there anymore. And just to be controversial, when I was in school, the headmaster got us all how to learn how to use punch card machines. This is the early days of computing. He said we'd have a job for life. It's exactly what most teachers are doing now, teaching kids how to program. Anything we can teach children on computers at the age of up to the age of 16 will be run by AI machines by the time they graduate. We're giving them completely useless skills, but we're not teaching them design, anthropology, how to handle human beings. In fact, we're creating a world in which autism is rewarded because that's the appropriate skill for programming. Like dyslexia is linked with innovation and so on. So again, we need to think about some of that because we've got to deal with it. So that brings us on to stories. And I'm going to show 2 slides now from Eric Blair or George Orwell. This is a famous quote. Yeah? A story is a lie, you see. It requires that facts are marshaled, summarized, and distorted to fit a thesis. Now, this is neither good nor bad, by the way. We all do it. One of the things that human beings do is they concatenate fragmented experiences to create a coherent story. Yeah, all the elements may be true, but the story as a whole didn't happen at the same time. Yeah? One of the things you find when you do lessons learned programs is people rechange history to meet the requirements of the present, and they're not being dishonest per se, it's just the way we evolved as a species. I'll give you some of the reasons for that in a minute. The other problem we got is that we got homogenization. If you remember Animal Farm, at the end, the pigs who led the revolution looked just like the capitalists. And part of the problem in society is one of the things that neoliberalism did is it destroyed variety in the political system. Now again, if you know your history, you know when there's no variety or choice in the political system, small extremist groups can get domination at very low energy cost. And again, you can see that's exactly what we're getting now. It's this point about difference and change. Yeah? So, Let's start to work through some of the science. This is from Heidegger. And sorry about man, but I can't put woman on the original quote, all right? And Heidegger had other problems as well, but as a philosopher, he was brilliant, all right? Man thinks he's the master of language, but language is the master of man. That's really important. If anybody's come across epigenetics yet, okay, it's one of the most scary things happening. Well, it's fascinating, but it's really scary. If you give bright mice the children of dumb mice to bring up, the children of the dumb mice are bright. Just think about that. We now know that culture inherits, and we know the mechanism, it's the allele structure of RNA. So actually, and we know Eva's work in Israel has shown the language you speak in your own lifetime, and the more sophisticated it is, the more intelligent your children will be, they inherit from you. Right? Now, the fact that culture and intelligence can inherit in that way has scary implications for society in terms of the way we think. But language is hugely powerful. How you describe, look at the way Trump uses language, it's really scary. All right? But he's using language the same way that Hitler or any demagogue has used language to trigger associated patterns of frustration rather than string together a coherent sentence. Right? So we've actually got to use language in a bit more consistent way. And then, kind of like where I've been building to on this, for some reason, I don't know, radiologists have offended the cognitive neuroscience community. I don't know what they did, but at some stage they did something very bad, and now all the experiments on cognitive bias have run on them. All right, so if you take a group of radiologists, and remember, these are people coming off a 4 or 5 generation body of knowledge. They've got detailed training, an average experience of 15 years. You give them a batch of X-rays, and on the final X-ray, you put a picture of a gorilla in plain view, which is 48 times the size of an average cancer nodule, and you ask them to look through the X-rays and spot anomalies. 83% don't see the gorilla, even though their eyes scan it. And the scary thing is the 17% who do see it come to believe they were wrong when they talk with the 83%. Now, this is not something you can overcome. This is part of what it is to be human. Yeah? You only ever scan about 3 to 4% of what's in front of you. 5% maybe. If you're Chinese, by the way, it doubles. The evolutionary requirements of the symbolic language have resulted in a more focus on context rather than object. Yeah, language has a profound single 1 to 2 generation impact on the brain, in terms of the way it works. So for most people in this room, you're going to scan 2 or 3% of what's in front of you. Having done that, you do a first fit pattern match based on your memories of your own experience and the vicarious memories of other people told you through stories. So the way we evolve to make decisions is to do a partial data scan and do a first fit pattern match. And that's what politicians like Trump play on. You're only going to pick up a small amount of what they say, you're going to associate it with patterns. Now, in evolutionary terms, you can see why this happens. If you think about the early hominoids on the savannas of Africa, or maybe the Mediterranean coast, that's got controversial lately, something large and yellow with very sharp teeth runs towards you at high speed. Do you want to autistically scan all available data, look up a catalogue of the flora and fauna of the African veldt, and having identified lion, look at best practice case studies on how to deal with lions? By that time, the only document of any use to you will be the book of Jonah from the Old Testament, which is the only written example I've found of how to escape from the digestive tract of a large carnivore told by a known survivor. Right? We evolved to make decisions very, very quickly based on a partial data scan privilege in our most recent experiences. I say my father was a veterinary surgeon. He got a medal once when I was about 14 because he spotted rabies in a dog. We had quarantine centres then, and the British policy, if rabies comes into the wildlife, we kill every mammal within a 1-mile radius. Human beings are exempt from that. The vets don't really agree with it. They think it's a bad containment policy. And the human being may have brought the rabies in the first place by smuggling in a dog. But either way, he spotted it day before dog was meant to be released, not manifested in a typical way. Okay, so Dad's got a medal. I'm a 14-year-old boy. I want to boast about this at school. I asked him about it. I said, how did you know? He said, well, firstly, I've seen rabies. I mean, he was in the veterinary corps during the war. So he served in Afghanistan and Egypt, so he saw a lot of rabies. But he said, I wouldn't have spotted it if I hadn't been telling you the story of the rabid jackal hunt the night before. So it was on my mind. I say a lot of my work has come from counterterrorism. If you actually look at the cases where it's detected, somebody noticed something and it matched something they were already thinking about. And this is actually a key principle called cognitive activation. How we scan data depends on what patterns are at the forefront of our mind. We've done a lot of work in safety, for example, by ritualizing safety practice. Famous case in New Zealand, where by getting lorry drivers to actually strap on heated belts, we halved accidents. Because what the belt did is it changed the activation pattern from driving to loading more or less instantly. And that's one of the ways that ritual actually works in human systems. The way people enter a building changes how they perceive it. It's actually quite interesting. If you can ritualize the entry into a space, you can change practice. If you want kids to learn, ritualizing the change between play and learning also changes the activation patterns. But the critical thing is, what are the day-to-day stories through which people are viewing the world? Now, nobody listened to me before Trump and Brexit, but after Trump and Brexit, I was called in fairly quickly, right? Because several of us have been saying for years, you're not listening to the street stories, you're listening to the results of opinion polls and focus groups, where people say what they think is the right thing to say. And the trouble is, facilitators hate me when I say this because they like facilitating groups. There's a massive criticism by anthropologists of participative action research because they say it privileges the culture of the facilitator. And this is a massive problem in development at the moment, is people who match the expectations of the evaluation teams, who are nearly always white first world people, are more likely to get rewards than people who don't. And again, that's not something you can prevent, it's just part of what we are. I'm building the case for the work we're doing here. So, let's run through some core sciences. Complex adaptive systems theory. How many people have heard of complexity? Okay, right, I'll give you the 101 lecture, right? There are 3 types of system in nature, and there are phase shifts between them. There are ordered systems, chaotic systems, and complex systems. So an ordered system has such a high level of constraint, all behavior is fully predictable. And that's good news. All right? We're actually quite good at this as human beings. We can create constraints, we can create rules, we can create social practices, which means we can create predictability. So order has value, unless it's taken to excess, at which point it causes catastrophic breakdown. I worked for IBM for 7 years. Anybody here work for IBM? Okay, it's the world's largest bureaucracy. It makes governments look like they're dynamic and proactive in terms of practice. So they bought the company I worked for, and the first thing they did, I mean, it's quite a shock, really. It took about 48 hours from initial approach to sell, and we had a shock to the system. The first thing they did was effectively to charge us for coffee and ban alcohol. Now, this is completely unreasonable. We were a software development house, all right? The coffee-alcohol cycle is critical to quality software development, right? Nobody should be expected to speak to users without alcohol first. You then need coffee to sober up to write the code. Then you need even more alcohol because users never want what you can prove they asked for. They want something else instead. See, this is the fate of IT. Right? We got over that, but then it got worse. They banned us for buying food for staff. Now, by now, we'd learned you didn't argue with IBM executives on an empirical basis or on the basis of customer or employee need. That didn't work. The only thing which occasionally worked was a Socratic technique in which you asked them questions till they contradicted themselves. If you do philosophy, you're taught this. It's an absolute delight, but you have to remember what happened to Socrates. Sooner or later, the people of Athens think you're corrupting the young and require you to commit suicide. But it's enjoyable while it lasts, all right? So we went along, we said, look, this is a brilliant idea. We would never have thought of banning food for staff. This is one of the benefits of joining IBM. And they looked pleased, so you start to realize that irony is a deadly weapon because they don't understand it. Right? And we said, give an example. The other night, 4 o'clock in the morning, I get called out. The higher you get up in a company, the more you only meet angry customers, all right? If you want to have a happy time, don't get promoted, all right? Until you get right to the top where you can delegate that to somebody else, all right? But the bit between is not fun, right? So as I get called out 4 o'clock in the morning, we've got a 999 service, an emergency service, which isn't live, because you idiots wouldn't pay for these programmers to go on a training course because you thought they could do it from the manual. That was actually the problem. All right, so we got to get this up, otherwise there's $1 million worth of penalties. The only thing I can do as a manager is keep people away from the technical staff to stop them asking questions, because then they won't be able to get the job done, and buy them pizza and Coke to keep them awake. They looked quite worried at that point, so I realized they may have misinterpreted it. So I do mean Coca-Cola, at which point they relaxed, but it did give us an idea for future crises. Right? They said, okay, well, we understand it may occasionally be necessary. It's all right, you have to get vice presidential approval 48 hours in advance. Now, at this point, you breathe a sigh and you say, God, that's even more brilliant. I mean, this is, we would never have thought of that before we were part of IBM, right? Now, sarcasm becomes a weapon to go with irony, because they don't get it either. And we said, what happens on the very rare occasion where we don't get 48 hours notice of a major crisis? Never answer their questions, just keep asking, right? And they said, okay, we understand that. Tell you what, country general manager approval after the event. Now, if you work for IBM, you now know they've said yes in a way which means no. Bureaucrats are brilliant at this, right? You know that your expenses will now disappear into the South Bank. They'll never be signed. And if you complain, your name will start to appear on the wrong sorts of lists. You don't want to be on those lists at quarter end, all right? Not in a consultancy business. So the practice emerged. I hasten to add, neither I nor anybody I know ever did this. I just heard about it on the grapevine. I want to be clear on this. Of over-tipping London taxi drivers. Because if you over-tip a London taxi driver, they give you a blank receipt. The blank receipt was then filled out for the money spent on pizza and Coke for staff. A parallel set of books were kept, or so I gather, right, in order to prove authentication. And the responsible manager took a bus but charged for the taxi. Now, I gave that story at the big IT conference in Berlin a few years back. 3 people from IBM ran up to me afterwards, opened their wallets, showed me them full of blank receipts, said, we're still doing that, did you invent it? If you over-constrain a system, people will work around it. You could take out 20% of the cost of the average organization by removing criminally constructed rules which prevent people doing what they know is right in the first place. And if you don't know it, all the available scientific evidence, without exception, says where people are working for explicit goals, it destroys intrinsic motivation. And where do we most need intrinsic motivation? In health, in social services, in education. Where do we have the most rigid set of targets? I'm doing a lot of work with nurses at the moment. They have to break the rules every day to provide empathetic care to patients. If they care about their patients, they have to break the rules. And you've all been in a similar situation. So an ordered system is valuable as long as you don't take it too far. A chaotic system is one where nothing is constrained by anything. It's completely random. Now, if that happens accidentally, it's a crisis. If we can use it deliberately, we can create innovative spaces. If we can destroy the existing patterns, novel patterns emerge. And we also use it on peace and reconciliation work, where we get multiple unconnected agents to interpret data. And I'll show you the result of that in a minute, because that's, again, an important process. So that's chaos, and then we get complexity. Complexity is a system where everything is connected with everything else, but we don't know what the connections are. And we have what we call dark constraints, reference to dark energy in cosmology. We can see the impact of a constraint, but we can't see what's causing it. Now, that's actually human society. You can't know all the possible connections. You can't engineer a social system. It's an ecosystem. It's not a machine. But for the last 30 or 40 years, we've been using engineering metaphors of society, and we really need to break that. Now, the key lesson of this is, depending on what type of system you're in, you will manage in a different way. And the best way I've ever learned to explain this is to give a real example. So how many people here have got experience of organizing a party for a bunch of 9-year-old kids? Okay, so this is the example, all right? We're going to look at the 9-year-old party from 3 perspectives: order, complexity, and chaos. Yeah? And by the way, you've made the mistake of holding the party in your own house. I mean, that's something we all grow out of fairly fast, all right? The value of community centers is they have fire hoses. Fire hoses are very useful for cleaning up after parties and are occasionally necessary for crowd control during the party itself. So let's look at how we would manage a party. So assume it's a chaotic system. That means there are no constraints. The children are completely free to do whatever they want, which means they'll probably discover drugs and alcohol and go on a personal experience of self-discovery. Your house may burn down in the process, but all property is theft, and it was socially constructed anyway, so why are you worried about it? There's a stiletto in that for certain academic colleagues. I don't recommend this. I've got a friend in California who did try it once. He'd just come back from Burning Man, and he was in some sort of ideological state, which divorced from reality. He's never going to do it again. The recovery cost was too high. The ordered systems approach, on the other hand, is taught in all good business schools. Under this, it's of critical importance to agree learning objectives for the party in advance of the party itself. The learning objectives should be aligned with the mission statement for education and society to which you belong, and should be clearly articulated and printed off on motivational posters with pictures of eagles throwing over valleys and water dropping into ponds, and you should put the posters around the room where you're going to hold the party. As the children come into the party, you give them Disney playing cards with a party value system printed on the back of it. And of course, you've produced a project plan for the party. The project plan has clear milestones throughout the party against which you can measure progress against ideal party outcome. And a senior adult starts the party with a motivational DVD. You don't want the children wasting time which isn't aligned with the learning objectives. And having demonstrated, and then, they use PowerPoint to demonstrate their personal commitment to the party and to show the children how their pocket money is linked to the achievement of the milestone targets. Following the highly successful completion of the party, you conduct the after-action review, update your best practice database on party management, and mandate future process improvements. If at this stage, for any remote reason, the children aren't happy, then you hire an appreciative inquiry practitioner who will get them to tell happy clappy stories so they have happy mental models and suitably indoctrinated like whatever you put in front of them next time. Everybody reasonably familiar with this approach to party management? The complex systems approach, on the other hand, is very different. We start off by drawing a line in the sand known as a boundary constraint in complexity. And excuse my language here, but it's necessary. We look the children squarely in the eye and we say, "Cross that, you little bastards, and you die." And one of the things we learn pretty fast as an adult is the value of flexible, negotiable boundaries, because rigid boundaries have a habit of breaking catastrophically when you least expect them. We then introduce catalytic probes, a football, a DVD, a barbecue, a computer game, and hope a pattern of play will form. It's called an attractor. And it's catalyzed. You can't create the attractor, you can only catalyze it. And if it's a beneficial one, you push kids towards it. If it's not beneficial, well, that's where you deploy the fire hoses. So what we do, and this is the key phrase, we manage the emergence of beneficial coherence within attractors, within boundaries. And we manage the only 3 things that you can manage in a complex adaptive system: the initial constraints, the probes, and the amplification or dampening strategies. And the critical thing, and this is going to be my final theme as I go through this, we manage the present, we don't manage to a future state. The characteristic of systems thinking over the last 30 or 40 years, and please do not confuse systems thinking with complexity, they're radically different. The characteristic of systems thinking, which dominates government worldwide, which is an engineering metaphor, is to say the way you handle uncertainty is you define where you want to be and close the gap. Yet the trouble is, that actually never works. The average British hospital has 511 outcome-based targets, with 21% of the budget going on managing the measurement system. And it's fairly similar in Australia and New Zealand. Because everybody keeps putting outcome target and outcome target and outcome target, and they all assume order with a linear relationship between cause and effect. In a complex system, all you can identify is the dispositional state of the system because it has no linear causality. It has multiple potentials, but it doesn't have any causal links. So managing the present is far more important than defining the future state. That also means you undertake journeys rather than trying to achieve goals. And if you undertake a journey, you're open to novelty on the pathway. If you have goals, nobody will innovate because goal achievement is more important than providing the actual thing the goal is measuring. That's one of the scary aspects of this. So complexity is really important because it allows us economy of effort. The trouble is it deals with essential inherent uncertainty. That's a quote from Brian Arthur. And I don't have to explain what that is, but I hope I don't in Australia. The only thing I know for certain about a complex adaptive system is whatever I do will have unintended consequences. That means at a government level, I am ethically responsible for them, even though I couldn't predict the actual consequence, I knew there were going to be unintended consequences. And that means you don't do big initiatives based on defined outcome because they're doomed. I say this in organizations, the last thing you should do if you want a change initiative is to announce a change initiative. Because the previous patterns of change initiatives are patterns of failure. So you'll trigger those memories. Yeah? You actually do is you do small things in the present and see what works. If they work well, you do more of them. If they work less, you do less. Yeah, that's actually the children's party metaphor in terms of the way it works. Another thing, this is a neologism, exaptation. Yeah, this is really important. It's something human beings are good at. So dinosaurs developed feathers. If you've got children who are into dinosaurs, I'm going to give you a major competitive advantage because the children's dinosaurs books are not up to date. All dinosaurs had feathers. We now know that from the discoveries in northern China. Yeah? And they evolved for warmth or sexual display. So in the fossil record, you can see dinosaurs with sort of extended limbs which had colored feathers. We can now do the color from the fossil record. It's quite fascinating what you can do. Right? What then happened is some dinosaurs started to fall from trees or fall off cliffs. If they had lots of feathers, they glided, and that's how we got flight. Exaptation is a trait which evolves for one function, under conditions of stress, exapts for something different. It couldn't happen in a linear way because if dinosaurs threw themselves off cliffs in the hope of evolving feathers before they hit the ground, they wouldn't have the opportunity to breed. Yeah? The cerebellum at the base of your brain evolved to manipulate muscles in fingers in the higher apes. It exapts in humans to manage grammar in human language. The sophistication of grammar couldn't have happened in an evolutionary linear way. It required a non-linear exaptive move. 1945, a Raytheon engineer maintaining the magneto of a radar machine notices that a chocolate bar melts in his pocket. Lots of people had noticed this. They'd sworn and had their trousers clean. He realized the significance. We got microwave ovens. The whole history of human invention is an exaptive history, not an adaptive history. The ability to rapidly repurpose existing capability for something novel is key. What I want to argue is librarians have skills which need to exapt, not adapt. And I'm going to come to some examples of that in a minute, but it's critical to invention. Linked with that is the concept of abstraction. If you don't know it, painting and music evolved in human beings at roughly the same time, and both come before language. It's a unique feature of human language. If you look at Cretaceous or ape languages, they name things. Human language evolved from abstractions. Now we know that the great value of abstraction is it allows you to make novel, unexpected connections. Yeah? I have three passions, all right? One is rugby. I'm Welsh. That's a religious issue. The other is opera. I'm Welsh. That's a religious issue. and the other is mountain walking. Well, I'm Welsh, we haven't got any alternative, all right? So all those three things come together. I have my best ideas in Wagner, because I've gone up a level of abstraction, so my brain is disconnected in such a way that it creates novel connections. We now know that human evolution and the inventors of human evolution is fundamentally predicated on the aesthetic, on art. If you actively focus on STEM education, you're making us less than human. Because actually art is critical to invention, and it's what allows us to do exaptation in the way. Conceptual blending. We don't make decisions in logical, constructed ways. What we do is we blend together fragmented triggered memories to come up with a unique form of action. Oh, and by the way, we never remember anything quite the same way twice. This is Freeman's work. There are chemicals which break up the neuroreceptors in the brain so that we're constantly mutating how we perceive the world. And in evolutionary terms, that has major advantage. That sort of uncertainty, fluidity is there. Now, I'm going through these because all of these are basic 101 science, but we need to start to think about them in terms of education. So let me move on and kind of like finish up on what is one of the major programs. This is called Engage, Empower, Enact. And the basic concept is we have to engage citizens in a new way, we have to empower them, and that's going to be critical, and then we have to enact what they come up with. And this is not going to happen by citizen parliaments and workshops and government labs. Those have all largely failed. They attract the usual suspects, and they're not scalable. Remember my criticism of participative action research, right? The big issue on government labs is it's just the people who match the facilitators, and they have a really good time. And again, we need to scale to much larger volumes. So and this originally came from counterterrorism, but it's now developed. What we started to do was to use the community as ethnographers to their own condition. And one of the things we found is that kids are brilliant at this. Nobody refuses a child on a school project, but everybody will ignore a market researcher. There's another thing called the grandparent syndrome. I've told my daughter very clearly, as far as I'm concerned, I'm trying to forget everything which happened between the age of 12 and 18. But the minute she has a daughter of her own, I'm going to remember every gory detail, all right? Basically, grandparents will tell things to their grandchildren that they won't tell to their children, and vice versa. And again, there's profound evolutionary reasons for that. If you survive to be a grandparent in primitive societies, then you had to stop leading the tribe because you weren't physically up to it, but the fact you'd survived made you wise, so you went into childcare. And actually, we're almost back there with second jobs. Grandparent to grandchild relationship is a primary teaching role, because it's a more relaxed environment. So one of the ones I'm proudest of, we got young girls, this is actually from that project, who've actually been subject to genital mutilation or rape, are now acting as ethnographers to other girls in their own areas at risk from the same horror. And they're getting data that no researcher could get. So the point is, kids become ethnographers to their own condition. We're doing that now, so the basic vision I've got here is that every 16-year-old in every school in the world actually is part of their school project, and by the way, it matches the school curriculum, is an ethnographer for a year. So that we actually have a distributed capture mechanism to replace polling, focus groups, and market research. That's the big vision on this. But to make that work, we have to empower them. And the principal area of power is interpretation, not in content. And this is where an awful lot of qualitative researchers get it really badly wrong. They want to get people's stories, transcribe the stories, tag and interpret the stories. The power is in interpretation, agency is in interpretation. If you sacrifice interpretation, you lose agency, you lose power. So the approach we adopted here was to get people to interpret their own stories. Now, you've all filled out an employee satisfaction form at some stage in your life. Everybody done that? I got one of these in IBM, and it said, does your manager consult you on a regular basis, scale of 0, not at all, 10 all the time? Everybody familiar with that one? You know exactly what answer they want, don't you? So you either gift it or game it. Either way, I phoned up HR, and I should say I was on an emergency call-out note in HR. There was a watch list for me. So I got put straight through to the centre. I'd just run a 6-month project, which had proved astrology was more accurate than Myers-Briggs in predicting team behaviour. And by the way, the two have roughly similar scientific basis to them. Yeah, it's just astrology's been going for longer, and for some reason they were irritated with me over this, all right? But either way. So I said, how do I answer this question? I've got several managers and people I take business direction from, and sometimes they consult me and sometimes they don't, and sometimes they should and sometimes they shouldn't. I said, this is a context-free question in a context-specific world. And she said, average your experience over the year and stop being difficult, all right? And I think she heard me saying, you call yourself HR in a research group, before she slammed the phone down on me, all right? We take a different approach. We go to, say, 10% of the workforce every month, and we say, what story would you tell your best friend if you were offered a job here? That's called a non-hypothesis question. And then we get people to interpret the story. So, for example, we give them a triangle which says the manager's behavior was altruistic, assertive, analytical. 3 positive qualities. So they don't know the right answer. And we've wired people up for this as well. What that does is it activates what Kleineman called thinking slow, not thinking fast, or what a real scientist would call novelty receptive, not autonomic processing. Yeah? Because if you don't know what the right answer is and you've got 6 triangles, it creates a cognitive load which forces you to go deeper. Yeah? And the key principle on this is it gets us quant data. So this is, for an example, from one of the big projects we've been doing in Northern Ireland, where we've now got 20,000 voices of patients on a continuous longitudinal capture, all interpreted by those patients. And of course, quantitative data convinces people. The key principle here is numbers are objective but don't persuade people. Stories persuade people but aren't objective. Put the two together, you're in a different place altogether. Yeah, so the fact that I send children out to gather stories from the community, and the children have worked with the adults to interpret their own stories, makes the results more or less impossible for a politician to challenge. And by the way, this is a key principle: advocacy has to be hard-baked into your research method. It also then allows us to make radical change. So this is from a project. It's a slightly hypothesized one. Yeah? This is actually looking at safety. Yeah? The vertical dimension is rule compliance. The horizontal dimension is job completion. The left one, this is an American manufacturing company. The left-hand one is civilian manufacture. The right is military. Now, you can immediately see the problem in civilian. You either get the job done or you follow the rules. The two are mutually exclusive categories. Every questionnaire, every focus group, every survey says they're doing both because they know that's the right answer. But the day-to-day observations of engineers on the floor tell a completely different picture. And by the way, nobody on the board challenged me when I showed this. The right looks more attractive because you've got that pattern in the top right, rule compliance, job completion, until you click on it and you discover that that's nuclear weapons testing, which creates an existential quality to rule compliance and job completion that you can't transfer to different contexts. You've then got get the job done, ignore the rules, and you've got to have given up. That is the pattern we are seeing in hospitals in Australasia, the UK, and the US. In a crisis, people are brilliant. On a day-to-day basis, people break the rules to get the job done, but increasingly despair is creeping into the system. Yeah? Now, the way we change that is not to create a program for the top right. You see in the right-hand picture that little cluster in the middle? That in complexity is called an adjacent possible. It's a pattern of stories near to the negative, but not so far away it's not an impossible step. And literally, we click on that, which allows us to read the stories, or hear the stories, or see the pictures. And we say, what can we do tomorrow to create more like this and fewer like that? And that's a whole new theory of change. Yeah? Not only that, that's the board-level picture. I can then actually produce the same picture from the source data for different groups. So when we just did this in South Wales, I can show the picture for South Wales to a minister, and the minister can say, what can I as a politician do to create more like this, fewer like that? but then Rhondda Council can see their own picture, or Ferndale Community Centre can see their own picture. And we just ran a big workshop in Ferndale where young people could be trained to use the technology, but only if they brought their grandparents with them to act as a pair. And that actually was a brilliant idea because young people are ideal, grandparents know how to get things done. So we didn't get disillusioned young people, but they could only come up with interventions which matched the narrative. What can we do tomorrow to create more like this, fewer like that? They came up with 100 ideas. How do you create full employment? That's a question which privileges a middle-class elite. What can we in our community do tomorrow to create more like this, fewer like that, is actually very different. And that's called a fractal approach. Yeah. What you're doing is the same source data represents it differently for different groups. Yeah. Now, we're now running that through community centres, through sports clubs, through schools. That's been packaged up so it can be adopted worldwide. The principle is we've got to allow people's own story to feed through, but also to allow them to connect across the world. Because if I look at more stories like mine, I can then connect and see how other people in other cultures are seeing the same problem, without the need for it to be mediated or interpreted by an agency. This is conflict resolution. This is actually from Columbia. We presented an infographic about a possible future state. We got everybody to interpret it in real time, and we drew the map. Now, I won't tell you which the communities are, but you can see that blue and green, there's no point in them sitting down to talk to each other, because they interpret the same data in radically different ways. The only thing they've got in common, by the way, is they hate the red guys in the middle. The strategy here is to make the two extremes more extreme, so we create something new in the center. This, by the way, is very powerful. If you do this, if you look, say, infographic, future of libraries, see how you index it, or how politicians index it, how people index it, that can explain an awful lot of things. The last thing you ask is explicit questions. You want to map the territory without bias within the system. So, to finish with a couple of quotes. Here's one of my favorite ones from Kierkegaard. Yeah? It's how do we see the possible? We're in a world where if you look at things in terms of probabilities, we face despair. But within that, there are things which are possible, which we need to find. And this is the poem, I want to finish with. This is a poem from R.S. Thomas, who's probably one of the greatest of the Anglo-Welsh poems. This lovely concept. I pass by something small that I now realize is significant. Yeah? The point I want to leave you with is it's in noticing small things that we can make a big difference. And to notice small things, you need a large network of people doing it. Yeah? We don't need big projects. We need small connections, novel approaches. I think librarians have got a major role to play in that, and thank you very much for your time.